And we are live. Welcome to Poets House, live streaming from the great ether/internet. My name is Paolo Javier, and I am a poet and program director of Poets House, a 30-plus-year-old literary nonprofit situated on Manhattan in Lenape Haking, or Ehenda Wikitit, the traditional and ancestral land of the Canarsie, Kapsi, Huerpos, Simunoy, and Wekwaski, collectively known today as the Ramapo, Nanticoke, Lenni Lenape, and Delaware Lenape. I offer my respect to Lenape people and to their continuing presence in their homeland and throughout the diaspora. I offer my reverence. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's program. I am so thrilled to be co-presenting this program called Made in Harlem, which is part of an esteemed ongoing series presented by Maisel Cinema, and I'm excited to be welcoming Emily Apter, who is one of the directors of Maisel Cinema, to this program today to tell us a little bit more about her organization.
Hi, thanks, Paolo. I'm live streaming from my apartment in Brooklyn. So yes, I just want to welcome everyone and say thank you so much to LaTasha and Zora and Paolo and everyone at the Poets House team who is making this possible. I'm a cinema programmer at the Maisel's Documentary Center, which is a nonprofit cinema and education center in Harlem. We were founded by the documentary filmmaker Albert Maisels in 2005, and you may know his work. He's most famous for making Grey Gardens and Salesman, Gimme Shelter. He and his brother David were known for pioneering a lot of the direct cinema documentary techniques starting in the 60s. So our cinema is closed, of course, right now, but we have a lot of digital programming that you can find on our website. We are just beyond excited to be partnering with Poets House to present today Isaac Julien's Looking for Langston from 1989. Paolo mentioned that this program falls within a larger series that we've been working on at the Maisel's Documentary Center called Made in Harlem in honor of the 100th anniversary of the Harlem Renaissance. And the series looks at the sort of wide-ranging lens of documentary film and the way that it's captured and commemorated and explored the many layers of experience that make up and continue to make up the Harlem Renaissance. And it brings together mostly non-fictional visual sources that together look at the long-lasting influence of the Harlem Renaissance and representations of political and artistic output, collective memory, present-day Black experiences in Harlem today. So this series would not be possible without support from the West Harlem Development Corporation. And yeah, I'm delighted to be looking at some of the literary legacies today via Isaac Julien and Langston Hughes, and a much anticipated discussion between LaTasha, Zora, and Paolo.
Many, many thanks to Maisel Cinema for really helping to co-present and to sponsor this program. I hope everyone gets a chance to check out Maisel Cinema when we are all able and ready to do so in the great neighborhood of Harlem. So I am equally pleased and honored to be welcoming our first presenter to today's program, Zora Syed, who is a scholar, a fantastic poet, and a much respected editor. And I don't really want to say anything more than that Zora published a really vital chapbook recently through CUNY's Lost and Found chapbook series on Langston Hughes, the journalist. And I think that's a really good place to end in my introduction and welcome Zora Syed to Poets House Live. Streaming from where, Zora?
Hi, thank you for that warm introduction. I'm calling in from Midwood in Brooklyn, and a very busy, boisterous place still, safely boisterous. So I'm happy to join here. I think that if we look at Hughes, if he hadn't faced so much racism after his return and McCarthyism after his return from Central Asia, it would have been, he would have produced an excellent and very thorough book on Central Asia. And the tragedy is that it had to be hidden away because of McCarthyism. What survives from the notes and what I was able to piece together is an is one of the best in-depth and sensitive readings that looks at relationships during his trip rather than an emphasis on what's different than being American. So as an American writer, it was quite insightful, I would say. I'm going to read from his own writings that were never published. Some he had turned into South to Samarkand, which was published 20 years later with a lot more humor. He had published something in the Soviet Union called A Negro Looks at Soviet Central Asia, and that is being annotated by another scholar. So I will begin reading just his words. Samarkand. This is 1932, by the way. He left from Harlem, and he was in Moscow, part of a film project that didn't take off, and he actually proposed a trip to the south of the Soviet Union, which was Central Asia, or Turkestan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, this part of the world. And he was one of the first Americans translated into Uzbek. At the Schomburg is a wonderful literary contract, a publishing contract written in Uzbek that he still has, that he kept from his trips. All right. Samarkand, city of Tamerlane, the earth shaker. Before that, city of Genghis Khan, leader of the Mongols. And ere that, the sporting ground of Alexander the Great, who murdered Clitus there 2,400 years ago, when both were drunk with wine. This is from the introduction to South to Samarkand. The readings here are actually from loose notebook pages that were written on the train from Moscow to Ashgabat in Turkmenistan. September 24, 1932. About noon, we passed through Orenburg and then into Asia, saw camels pulling wagons. Sadiq Korbanov, the chairman of the city Soviet of Old Bukhara, came into our coach and told us about his country, the rolling steppes. September 25, 1932. Today we are really in Asia. Yurts, Kazakhs, camels. We passed the north end of the Aral Sea. At Kalyalinsk, in the late afternoon, we hold a Gorky meeting in honor of his 40 years as a writer. A Jewish komsomol, poet, a Russian train worker, an Uzbek, and myself spoke here in the desert. I made a speech in English, which the Hollander who spoke Flemish translated into Russian, and the Russian then translated into Turkmen. I wonder what I was said to have said by then. At any rate, the audience applauded when the paraphrase was over, and I was cheered as the first American to ever make a speech in Ashgabat. We see a lot of his humor and his poetry in his notebooks. Here's a poem that was handwritten. I don't know, he never returned to this poem, but I thought it was quite beautiful. Sandstorm. When the wind walks across the desert and the sand rises to greet it, something in the wind wakes the sand to frenzy, and they dance together. Wind and sand, beneath the sun, whirling, moaning, laughing with gritty laughter, the wind and sand forget about the camels and the caravans. I found that a poet keeping a journal was still writing poetry and still writing stories throughout. So you see the musicality and these short haiku poems that seem to come through. Here's another one that was actually a cutout piece of paper. All it says is, through the desert, under the blazing sky, eyebrows painted straight across the forehead in a single black line. Here's another observation in his notes, cut up papers as well. The archive, since we watched the film, archival photos are a big part of that collection. For Hughes, he kept every bit of minutia. So there were cut up papers, there were notebooks, there were typed notes, they were snipped together and stapled together, but everything was kept. That's what makes the archive so rich. Here's his notes in Tashkent. Woman in streetcar with baby. Conductor to woman. A nice fine baby like that. Why don't you keep his nose clean? Woman. Tomorrow I'm going to the baths. Conductor. You have to go to the baths to keep nose clean? General laughter in the car and scolding all visible children with unwiped noses. But the Uzbek woman rode on, her child's nose as it was before. The little bandit and his bird that he boiled and reboiled, slept in his clothes, wiped his nose on his towel, spoke Russian badly, and played well on their two-stringed, long-necked guitar. The sink always stopped up with cigarettes and tea, overshoes forever at the door. So it's hard to imagine these were unpublished. There are other notes in his journal that are about connections. He saw there a connection between Uzbeks who, under the Tsarist rule, were separated. So white Tsarists went into one area and Uzbeks and natives were in another area. It's the post-colonial or the colonial segregation that he saw. So the connections that he was making with the poets were most important. This is why at the back of the photographs, the small side marginal notes he kept, it expresses notes that show a kind of friendship. They all write something about his smile, about his friendship, about his warmth. And these traits are highly valued traits: hospitality, friendship, eating together. Probably not something we're all worried about now, but eating together from one plate. These were all Central Asian customs that Hughes sits right along with Uzbeks, Turkmens, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and eats along with them. And that's one thing that broke a lot of the barriers, so that he didn't write us and them. He wrote with the people. He wrote about relationships and the universal that he found, but also the specific historical details that other travelers who went during that time period overlooked. Here's another note from his diary. At Metropole, Amur Sanon, poet, Kalmyk region in Caspian, Dolgan, director of Auto Trust. He says, we are dark people too. That's another one about connections. What Hughes did was also, he translated very rare texts in his lifetime. He worked not only to write poetry, songs, and stories, but he really developed a lot of friendships. And this is not just Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan, but he was quite worldly and cosmopolitan. So the poem that he translated here, it looks like it was one of the poems that were most likely banned as ethnic chauvinist texts that Soviet-era writers' unions did not allow to be printed. So this is called Old Uzbek Poem. In his notes, not only has he translated, but he notes the female translator who was apparently talking to him with her child in her lap as they were breaking down this poem. So this is Old Uzbek Poem from Hughes. I told her, charming, you must wear on the sugar of your wrists the circles of golden bracelets, for ornaments are adornments good for a beauty. And she answered me with sweet coquetry, I am afraid the web of my hands cannot stand the weight of gold. And I told her, enchantress, in the deep forest of your hair you must put ribbons of pearls, and the shining of your hair will rival the glitter of the pearls. And she answered, I am afraid that the tender reed of my body will be bent beneath the weight of pearls. I told her, magician, you must cover the flowers of your body with cashmere silk, and then your beauty will be as fresh as the roses in the sunrise. And she answered, I am afraid that the silk will spoil the petals of my flower-like body. So here the beloved and the lover have interaction, but the beloved is boasting about herself. It's a very old medieval type of poetry, and he brought this back in the notebooks. He did not publish this. He published a translation that he worked on with Nina Zarakovits. He worked with her on several translations of poetry from the Russian. Ghafar Ghulam is a communist Uzbek poet, And his work was not translated into English. He had published it in a leftist journal when he came back, just to show you the difference in the different styles of poetry. And he was collecting and being aware of colonial era, medieval era, which is the glory days of Central Asia, and then communist era, social equality, and social activist type of poetry. So this is from Ghafur Ghulam, his translation. I'll just read a few lines. Along these roads very ancient, across these steppes and mountains and valleys, went slaves and widows, their necks in iron chains, 5, 10, hundreds of millions of men, condemned, weakened, hunted by sorrow, and they came again to sorrow. So this fits much more the aesthetics of Soviet Uzbek poetry at the time. Again, just to show you the way Hughes works in collecting his notes. He didn't have one angle, and he wasn't pushing the Soviet agenda that the authorities were hoping that he would push. So when the Soviet Union brought African American writers, actors, and activists to Moscow, they had hoped they would find a kind of a propaganda voice among the writers. So Hughes is quite interesting because he supports the equality, and he definitely supports the communist ideals. But what he does is that he subverts the authority. So when he's given a scheduled trip through Central Asia, he jumps off the train and then he goes off on his own adventure, and he communicates using what he says, hand gestures and a little bit of French, and he was able to get through in Ashgabat, Turkmenistan. There he met Arthur Koestler. He was playing jazz. Arthur Koestler came to him in the hotel. They traveled together with the Turkmen poet Shali Kekalov, who would translate into Russian for Koestler. Koestler would translate into English. So it would be Turkmen to Russian to English. With Nina Zarkovets, it was Russian to French to English. So the translations were quite fun, and the selection I read was also about misunderstandings. What I want to end off with is probably one of the most important finds for me as a Uzbek Afghan American who has my history comes from, or my family mythology or migration starts from about 1920s and 30s in Uzbekistan. And it's what allowed me to read the text, the material, the poetry that was left for Hughes was written in Old Chagatai Uzbek. It was written in Old Uzbek. There was a translation of this poem by Karim Ahmadi, one of the poets he had met in Tashkent, 1933. In the Beinecke archives, there are a lot of photos of Karim Ahmadi, although in the published writings, there isn't really a reference to him. And the reference to the Turkmen poet Shali Kekalov was as Charlie. So we miss a lot of the names. It was important for me to find that relationship, and finding this poem, not that it was disorganized, the archives are always organized, but finding in the sense that Karim Ahmadi had been filed under Karen Ahmadi. And this whole search has been through adventures and dreams and family mythology and ghost stories. So I found the 9 pages of the poem written in Old Uzbek, translated very differently than what we read. So I worked with my father to translate. And the poem is called For Langston Hughes on His Arrival to Uzbekistan. So let me read the version that my father and I translated from the poem in 1932, written in 1933. Poems for Langston Hughes on his arrival to Uzbekistan. Crossing many oceans you've come, leaving your family behind. I saw you and felt wrapped in the curls of your hair, the black and white of you, a protective eye talisman, entered my poor home. When I look in your beautiful eyes, I loved you. In front of your glowing face, your words came like stars. And now, you must hold my words. I am powerless in the face of the Komsomol. I am hiding. You are a sacred race. Low is anyone who calls them barbarians. Our tongues are folded away. We have many novels, poems that are woven in tears. He was given a translation of this poem. I don't know if it was in his handwriting or someone else's, but it was a one-page translation that was absolutely the opposite of everything that was written in that poem. So this is the translation that was in the archives. Listen to me, dear Langston. To LH on his arrival in Uzbekistan. I greet your arrival, the hero man. Hey, you who came across the ocean, the lion who conquered the waves of the sea. I am bound to you as tightly as the curls of your hair, and when I saw your eyes, I loved you. Welcome you, the poor son of the West. When my eyes look into your lively, laughing eyes, I see the suppression of your people. But when I see your smiling face, I raise my fist against the West. Why? Because in your face there are the winds of cold, bitter days. Their aim is to take you by the throat, to oppress you, the devils. So that translation takes away a lot of the, again, medieval romanticized language in the actual poem. I think there's a very big difference between I saw you and felt wrapped in the curls of your hair to I am bound to you as tightly as the curls of your hair. Maybe a slight difference, feels a little more romantic in the other one. So this poem is separated from this great photo of Hughes in a hat with the Uzbek poet Karim Ahmadi, who's wearing an Uzbek traditional chapan, big wheelbarrow behind them, and just sort of posing in the middle of winter in Tashkent. I want to end on that poem because for me, the way Hughes saw Central Asia and how he interacted and the friendships is something I wanted to bring back to the US. And then back to Central Asia, I wanted to return the work that Hughes records in his diaries and journals of African Americans who built the cotton industry in Uzbekistan. So these two conversations, I think, need to happen. And so those are Hughes's worldly adventures in Central Asia.
Thank you so much, Zora. As ever, I am inspired with a million questions after a presentation, but we'll get to hopefully at least a fraction of them, those million questions, after LaTasha's presentation. Welcome, a terrific poet, a trailblazer for me. I used to watch this next poet perform in the West Village. To call this poet merely a poet without the capital P, or actually all caps, would be a disservice to LaTasha Diggs's range as a poet, performer, editor, galvanizer, and just a pioneer in all of these arts that she excels in. And also a longtime resident of Harlem. I'm so excited and thrilled and honored to welcome LaTasha Diggs to our program today.
Howdy.
LaTasha, how you doing?
I'm doing good, considering I'm alive. First, I want to thank Paolo and Poets House, as well as Maisels, for putting this event together. It's a lot of thoughts come to mind, but I won't babble that much. I do want to give a quick nod back to Zora Saed. One thing that is particularly special about the project that she did was that these archives, these notes and photographs and pieces of paper clipped, were in the archives and no one knew about them. They were in a file, and it was Zora who actually introduced all of us, shall we say, to Langston's journeys and his experiences with people of Central Asia. So I want to give her a nod quickly. So what I'm going to do is a little scramble of sorts. Last night, I was digging through the piles of books because I wanted to read from, I believe, his last book that was published in July 17th, 1967. And this is some months after his death, which was May 22nd, 1967. The Panther and the Lash. I wanted to read some of the poems because, according to my memory, I think this might have been the first Langston Hughes book I read. I came to Langston Hughes late, despite the fact that I'm someone who's born and raised in Harlem. And I think I might have heard the Weary Blues, but it was really this book that became my introduction. So I'm going to read a couple of the poems. I find this book special because while there's work that ranges from the 1930s up until his death, it also includes longer poems by Langston, as well as poems that where he's responding to events that are taking place on the African continent. So while they explore Harlem, they're also exploring the South, but also exploring Patrice Lumumba, Angola, Johannesburg, and so on. So let me get into reading some. Harlem. Here on the edge of hell stands Harlem, remembering the old lies, the old kicks in the back, the old be patient they told us before. Sure, we remember. Now, when the man at the corner store says sugar's gone up another 2 cents and bread 1, and there's a new tax on cigarettes, we remember the job we never had, never could get, and can't have now because we're colored. So we stand here on the edge of hell in Harlem and look out on the world and wonder what we're going to do in the face of what we remember. Motto. I play it cool and dig all jive. That's the reason I stay alive. My motto as I live and learn is dig and be dug in return. Death in Yorkville. How many bullets does it take to kill a 15-year-old child? How many bullets does it take to kill me? How many centuries does it take to bind my mind, chain my feet, rope my neck, lynch me, unfree? From the slave chain to the lynch rope to the bullets of Yorkville, Jamestown, 1619 to 1963, Emancipation Centennial, 100 years not free. Civil War Centennial, 1965. How many centennials does it take to kill me? Stay alive. When the long hot summers come, death ain't no jive. Ghosts of 1619. Ghosts of all too solid flesh, dark ghosts come back to haunt you now. These dark ghosts to haunt you, yet ghosts so solid, ghosts so real. They may not only haunt you, but rape, rob, steal, sit in, stand in, stall in, vote in, even vote for real in Alabama, and voting not give a damn for the fact that white was right until last night. Last night. What happened then? Flesh and blood ghosts become flesh and blood men. Got tired of asking when. Although minority, suddenly became majority, metaphysically speaking, is seeking authority? How can one man be 10, or 10 be 110, or 1,010, or 1,000,010, or but 1,010, or 110, or 10, or 1, or none, being ghost of then? Dinner guest, me. I know I am the nigger problem, being wined and dined, answering the usual questions that came to white mind, which seeks demurely to probe in polite way the why and wherewithal of darkness USA. Wondering how things got this way in curate democratic night, murmuring gently over foies de bois. I'm so ashamed of being white. The lobster is delicious, the wine divine, and center of attention at the Damas table, mine. To be a problem on Park Avenue at 8 is not so bad. Solutions to the problem, of course, wait. And the last one from The Panther and the Lash, little song on housing. Here I come, been saving all my life to get a nice home for me and my wife. White folks flee as soon as you see my problems and me. Neighborhood's clean, but the house is old. Prices are doubled. When I get sold, still I buy. White folks fly. Soon as you spy, my wife and I. And only because Paolo asked me to, I'm gonna read just 2 poems that are from an ongoing body of work with no title yet. Jesus, Children of America. Hear mama muddle, moan, her spirit a high, sour mourn. From covers moving, words muffled, move parallel. Can't stand for nothing cause mama can't stand upright, medicated on fortified. View mama case record a feet high from a record crate. No rose sweeter save maybe those dried in Bibles. Self-taught hand-sewn hymns, high water. Transfer in marrow, narrow men. Wax thee, whip her and me holy. Care saves no one near a pint of chilled transcendental. Common sense in common areas. See mama overrun, raggedy redeemer, mourn markings, hook scars on skull, vicious vex seedy arenas. Mama drown in high gutter, raw murmur. Only boy stillborn, now mama ration muscatel, misery loves company. Mania a mascot. 7 Marys in the tree, ain't one was mama to mama. Rack at this mildewed memoir. That black mold will get you. Holy roller soliciting for a muse. Rescue me, rescue my mauled mama. I come from nervous noir. And the last poem. Son of a Negro explorer, not at the North Pole. Hawk the rabbit trim, darling. The iconographic halo shadows your stare. Whose barber makes the grooming regal? What do you point towards? Silver leaf children pray to your Nikes, tangerine and blood and japanned leather. Can you see father? Hold the pose, Henson's legacy. decadent of Inuit, cloudbursts of wonderful sexy. His is your bequest, seamen and Arctic booty. Clock wolves, rock the navigator, hand over your barbecue whale meat, polar bear and little Louie's French kiss. Mirror, mirror at the ball, Walrus blubber carved with your sword. Familiar, foreign. Lime cargoes reflect the cold tundra sun. Your name, Anukak of the polar grounds. Where's your father? Perk contests the dog sled as prop. Chiseled Arabian, your pallid companion. Bitch, walk. Thank you.
Thank you, LaTasha. Wow. What we're going to do next is, well, I certainly want to talk about your new work, but what we're going to do right now is we're going to show a trailer of Isaac Julien's Looking for Langston. And then I'm going to welcome both Zohra Saed and LaTasha Diggs back for a much anticipated conversation about all of these. So here's a trailer of Isaac Julien's groundbreaking and remarkable documentary. And that was a trailer from Isaac Julien's 1989 documentary, Fantasia, cine essay, tribute to Langston Hughes and his remarkable community and his poetry, certainly. Welcome back, Zohra Saed and LaTasha Diggs. I got to say, I've seen this documentary multiple times, and I rewatched it last night, and I have not changed in terms of my gut response to it, which is it is still sexy, it is still beautiful, but what has added to my appreciation of it is I guess the political intentions of both Isaac Julien and I guess just the moment that we're in, where the gaze that went into the making of this film and the gaze that runs throughout this film, so groundbreaking for its time, but to actually see it today, I feel it in so many different ways and new ways that I thought might be a good place for us to start, given Zora, you were talking about how Langston would look at and write with the people he was encountering in his travels, right? And LaTasha, you're reading poems of Langston's, and one of the things that both initially stopped me from really appreciating Langston Hughes when I first encountered his work in middle school and grew to appreciate later on was what was not on the page that was making him write these poems in terms of performativity that Isaac Julien's documentary brings home, in terms of the footage of Langston playing in front of a band, and just how truly visionary and interdisciplinary Langston Hughes was. So let's start there, maybe with the gaze, and I'm happy to follow you where you lead us.
Oh boy, I think one of the one was that I had not seen this film in a very, very long time. And so watching it in preparation for this conversation, I was reintroducing myself to the filmmaker's meditation, elegy, I want to say lullaby, but a sort of a song, shall we say, to not just Langston, but also the other writers that are invoked in this piece. And so watching it, I didn't remember how little Langston's work is actually in the film, which I didn't remember. And I had to ask myself why was that the case, beyond, copyright things. And did it need to be, or was this Isaac's choice to not to kind of gesture towards what Langston may have not been able to do when he was alive, or what he chose to be more important as his public persona, and how he would support other writers and the Black experience and the global experience, minus the gay experience. So it made me think a lot about that. But it also made me think about, if I wrote, what did I write down here? How much pressure he was under as someone who was very public, but at the same time private. What would Langston have written about just a couple of years later had he survived? And I'll pass it on to Zora.
This is the first time I'm watching it. I thought that what LaTasha said is really powerful. There is something in Harlem Renaissance poetry that both takes, and there's a line of this in the archival footage used, and in a conversation on, or a visual conversation, I would say, on Harlem Renaissance poets and artists and sculptors, because you see the actual footage that people did not see. And one of the things with the Julien documentary that was, for me, I took documentary very literally, but this film was definitely a very poetic take on this, and it has a dreamlike quality to it. But that moving between, that sort of interweaving of archival footage, seeing Hughes looking at art, seeing Hughes reading poetry, like LaTasha said, and or as Paolo said, in front of a band. I mean, all of these things bring him to life, but then the stories and the relationships and the intimacies and the worlds that he may have not expressed. I know that not many people were supporters of the film, or the supporters of the way Isaac Julien had originally read it, but it's such a beautiful poetic homage to him that it's hard to believe that people could find this controversial. I would say something else that really struck me, that just to continue on with Hughes and what he was doing with his poetry, I'm always wondering why Hughes was never included as a modernist poet, because he rejected this push for Harlem Renaissance poets and artists to create primitivist type of primitivism, and to go into sort of African, the essence of what it meant to be African, which is what he was getting funding for early on. And he breaks that relationship, especially in the 1930s when he's goes off on this Moscow journey. he breaks a relationship with his sort of mentor and sort of benefactor because he does not want to produce this. He wants to take the primitive, like modernist artists and writers, and construct it into his own narrative, into his own story. And I think that contrast cost him. He did stand up a lot for himself early on as well. The film, I think the other thing that really struck out for me in the film was I felt like the music also said a lot. There's a soundscape that felt like the pauses in between the journal readings and the time in the library looking at his handwriting and these short interactions that he was able to catch. So that's definitely not an intellectual analysis. I hope you'll forgive me for that, but as a feeling, it definitely struck me as quite true to the pauses in Hughes's writing between thoughts, I thought.
Yeah, I must say that when I'd seen the documentary on PBS, and I was anticipating to find and to see Langston Hughes in, I guess, the more conventional sense of documentary narratives. And when I wasn't going to actually see that documentary, it actually made it more meaningful. It stayed with me. It was more haunting for me, but it was also powerful and uplifting because to see that the gaze, in hindsight, I realized Isaac Julien's gaze, right? And I think maybe you can correct me on this, Zora, because you know more about Langston Hughes's biography than I do, but he had one of his partners whom he named Beauty, which I think Julien's film alludes to have, you know, whether it's Fantasia, whether it's fictional, you know, autofiction, to have Langston Hughes, the character, the object of desire, right, be someone else who's Black or who's brown, and for the same standards of beauty that Robert Mapplethorpe problematically applied to the Black male figure in the 80s, and this documentary was made in 1989, to actually have Isaac Julien make that gaze his own, but then also have the structuralist critique of how is Langston Hughes framed. For me, in hindsight, I see that now, right? You know, perhaps we're still looking for Langston, you know, I'm not sure. So that leads me to my next question. How did you get involved in this archival work with Langston Hughes?
I actually saw it online. There was a photo of Hughes and other Central Asian writers, and the write-up had said, here's Langston Hughes, here's one other identified poet, and everyone else was probably killed in this photo. And I thought, there has to be more to the story than just that everyone died and that was it. I mean, so I went thinking that there was a complete document. This is while I was a PhD student. My work was on Afghan American women's video art. But then when I found this, it just intrigued me, and I left that work to go to the Yale Library, and I called up the wrong numbers. I thought there was a complete work called From Harlem to Samarkand, which what I thought was in the reading. It was in it was a Central Asian Studies magazine type. I forgot what it was called. So I called up the wrong file, and I ended up finding his notebooks that said From Russia to China. And what I thought it would just be Russia and then jumps to China, but it was actually just about Central Asia, and that the way it was filed in the 1950s, there wasn't a specification, like anything written with Arabic alphabets was filed as Arabic, nothing Persian or Turkic was sort of read. Everything that looked like an Asian face was filed as China. So there was a missing connection between these notebooks and the photos that were there. So no one had really looked through it. From what it looked like, it was all the binding was pretty clean on the notebooks. I transcribed the notebooks, and then I footnoted the notebooks because I could see that he was building a history. And then I went to the Schomburg thinking there was something else. I got a fellowship there as well. The Lost and Found people at CUNY Grad Center. Emil Alcalay is my mentor, so he was very excited. I thought that it would be like, hey, let's look at this cool thing, and I would have left it behind, but he encouraged me to pursue it. And it's because of him I was able to find a missing, or a sort of a sealed envelope at the Schomburg Library, which had all of the key names and writings and published material of the Central Asian poets that he was photographed with. So it turned out that many were still alive, or alive enough to be prominent and important Central Asian poets. And it's the note-keeping of Hughes, it's the relationships, it's the poems they wrote back and forth, marginal notes, what he came back with, what he had hoped to create with the notes that he had, that really inspired me to do the detective work and piece together these two archives. So that's 3 years of work and ongoing.
And it makes me think about, you know, who else we're not looking at closely in terms of, right, to get a fuller picture of the cultural experience and interest and vision, right, of members of the Harlem Renaissance. I imagine that this documentary of Julien's was partially made in homage to James Baldwin, who I think had passed 2 years before it was produced. But also, in 1989, we're talking about, right, the AIDS epidemic, right, ravaging Black and Brown communities, but really Black and Brown communities were not front and center in terms of who's being deeply affected by this. And the documentary has really remarkable poets like Essex Hemphill, who was a spoken word pioneer based in DC. And you also have Stuart Hall, who writes about Fanon, and he's a cultural critic. Mm-hmm. And you have him in there reading, and it's an international reach that the documentary is trying to make, which actually is something that I'm very curious of in our appraisal of the Harlem Renaissance, the beats, modernism that include non-European writers, right, negritude, and to really map those out. And LaTasha, you have a very similar internationalist vision. You travel, your work spans languages, your travels span continents. What was your response to how both Julien's documentary considers Langston Hughes, or looks for Langston Hughes, and vis-a-vis, I guess, Zora Syed's findings of Langston, you know? Because it seems like in the documentary, Langston remains elusive, but that seems to be purposeful. But then in Zora's, we have this incredible discovery being made. And for you, as someone who comes out of multiple traditions, but I think to be an amazing experimental poet, how did you, appreciate both of these?
It made me think of Langston's other encounters with writers from literally all over the world, and to hone it down to Harlem, his interactions with Afro-Latino writers, writers from the Caribbean, writers from the African continent, as well as writers from Asia. It also immediately made me think of John Keane's collection of short stories and novellas entitled Counter Narratives, in which John writes this very short story about an encounter between Langston and a Mexican writer. And that's all I'll give you for right now regarding that story. But it made me think of how writers now are really trying to, under a microscope, see the many different sides of Langston Hughes beyond the poems that we are so familiar with since preschool. And with Zora's work, that to me was just proof that beyond what we may or may not know about Langston's personal life, he was someone who was really in communication with a lot of people, and wanted to be.
Yeah, and I think what I also got from Lucien's documentary, I mean, it was somewhat fleeting because there were multiple voices throughout the documentary, multiple gazes in the narrative, but there was a mention of a critique of Hughes's white patron, right, and white patronage in general, and the way that the Harlem Renaissance has been framed for me as a emerging poet, right? I always felt there was something missing to it, right? And well, I think as I've gotten older, it really is just the internationalist vision of all artists and, you know, great artists in general, and why in the framing of the Harlem Renaissance as they teach it to you, in my experience, right, has it been so, you know, narrow, right? And it makes me think about the recent controversy with the New York Times and Roberta Smith, and her talking about how Black art has landed, has finally arrived. And you have Langston Hughes back then saying, no, this is not what the Harlem Renaissance can and will only be about. And the autonomy and agency that Langston Hughes both fought for and got to enjoy. Right. So, Zora, I wanted to ask you, when Langston was traveling, what were his experiences like as an American?
I want to say one thing about Harlem being an international place, and that the Harlem Renaissance is packaged in a way that makes it, I don't know if I should say diluted, but there is a packaging that's very different than the time itself, the movement that was happening before it had the name Harlem Renaissance, right? The struggles and the concepts they were working and molding and breaking through. So I want to say also that Harlem in the 1930s was very much a place where it launched people into these international trips, whether it's Central Asia, Asia, Moscow, Cuba, all these places that African American writers had been traveling to. To Central Asia, Paul Robeson had gone earlier, and he received even a Stalin medal later on. But he was most popular. So it's Waylon Rudd's. Claude McKay didn't go there, but W.E.B. Du Bois had gone to a conference in Central Asia, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. There were a lot of Afro-Asian writers coming together and working and traveling or having conferences. The Afro-Asia Bandung Conference was one. But Hughes is one of the earliest and the first Black American to enter Central Asia. There was only maybe two Americans who went as diplomats in the 19th century, but Hughes is really the first poet to be translated into Uzbek. His Weary Blues is translated. The Schomburg has this great gift of a contract that was written in Uzbek. And in it, he said he's paid more and he can live on what he makes as a writer in Central Asia. Now, the other thing about Hughes's trip is that he proposed the trip. They were not for sending people over because they were still counter-revolutionaries, which would be my ancestors, counter-revolutionaries in Central Asia, and they were not sure if it was fully under control enough to send Americans there. But because he insisted, and he was very persuasive and charming, everyone writes about how charming Langston Hughes is, they let him go. And again, like I said, he jumped off and went on his own journey. Now, he taught writing workshops there to factory workers, to people he met along the way. He was also not the first African American there. Besides performers, there were cotton engineers and architects and road builders. I guess I'd be an engineer. This humanities person didn't know that. Engineers and agriculturalists from Tuskegee and from Virginia Tech, who could not get jobs here because of racism, went to Uzbekistan and built a little tiny place in rural Uzbekistan where by the time Hughes got there in December 1932, they were able to have a Christmas dinner with pumpkin pie and, turkey. Maybe it was lamb, but they got turkey. And had this tiny little American experience and culture sort of in rural Uzbekistan. So although Hughes is not always about finding comfort and finding people like him when he travels. So that's what makes him very interesting.
Yeah, I was going to add to Zora, because she brought it up. Richard Wright actually wrote an account of the Bangdong Conference of 1955 called The Color Curtain. And so highly recommended as a document of that time of particularly Black Americans traveling overseas.
Well, we are sadly out of time, and as ever, we are only scratching the surface with the tip of the iceberg of our conversation. I do just want to plug this photo of Helen Johnson, whose CUNY Lost and Found book continues to be a delight for me and a real inspiration. And Helen Johnson is one of, I think, many other Harlem Renaissance writers who we could have devoted this program to. And I just wanted to thank both Zohra Saed and LaTasha Diggs. Zora, you're in Midwood, and LaTasha, you're in Harlem. Thank you both so much for being a part of this program. It's also it's Earth Day, and I want everybody to continue their fight for the earth and touch the earth if you can, with gloves on if you feel inclined, and be safe. And I look forward to seeing you both again. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
And that's tonight's program. My thanks again to our guests, Zohra Saed and LaTasha Diggs. I am Paolo Javier, poet and program director of Poets House. Be safe, be kind to one another. Let's celebrate, and let's continue to honor and fight for our earth. Take care, everybody.